So somebody asked me the question that is it important to have a Q&A session after your speech? And you know what? This is a tricky one here. Now, I'm Gulraj Singh Shahpuri. I'm a success coach and a leadership trainer. And there's three important things that I want to talk to you about this. But before we get started, subscribe to my YouTube channel. By doing this, these videos come right to you. In addition, like and comment. I'll look at what you guys are putting in the comments and I'll interact with you to add value. Take a moment to give your helpful suggestions as well and share your stories so that others can benefit from this around the world. Guys, the long and short about this is I always like to have a Q&A session after my speeches. You know what, if you're generally a well-informed person or a well-read person, you have nothing to worry about. What happens is that when you're talking normally, you're fine, but when you're talking to people right after a speech or during a speech, you know what, your intelligence quotient actually goes up much, much higher. And you'll be surprised how many brain cells are being used at the same time. So trust me, when you're in the zone and when you're speaking, you're actually a lot smarter than you otherwise would be. And if you're just sitting otherwise at your table or at your desk and somebody asks you a question, you might not have the answer. But when you're speaking, you're actually a lot more brighter. The second thing I wanted to suggest is, and I don't really condone this, is that you can actually plant questions. Now, do this if you're a beginner, because you know what, sometimes what happens is when you give an incredible speech and you ask, okay, are there any questions? And nobody puts up their hand. Now, a perfectly good impression that you've already created that this was a tremendous speech, and everybody goes home and says, you know what? Well, nobody asked any questions. That must mean that it wasn't really a good speech. Maybe I was wrong, and others, because nobody was curious, that this wasn't a good speech. I don't really recommend you manufacture a speech this way, but at the beginning, if you did this, that's fine. So what happens is, the best way to do it is don't actually give out slips to people and say, okay, would you ask this question? Would you ask this question? Because you know what? People goof it up. They might even just say, oh, and they'll pick up a slip and they're asking a question from there. So the best way to do it is actually do it in a genuine way. Go a little early, interact with people before the speech. And when you're interacting with people, and tell them, look, I'm going to be speaking about this and this and this. By the way, do you guys ever have any questions about this? And when they have a question, in case you're going to address that thing in your speech, delete it now and say, you know what, I wasn't going to talk about this, but why don't you bring it up? Bring it up after the speech in the Q&A round. And you know what, at that time, I'd like to address this. You see, the question and answer round, guys, is just a way, it's just a segment of your speech. So your actual talk is one segment. What you did before the talk is actually also part of your speech, but you're doing that with a select crowd. And after your speech, the Q&A, the questions and answers, is actually a part of your speech as well. So you can actually put some things in there, especially your FAQs. You can put that after your speech in the Q&A, but you have to do it in a nice, decent way and set it up in a way that people are asking you these questions, because it's a lot more effective that way. So now, in your Q&A, when somebody asks you a question, or what if you can even say this in your speech, you can, when in the Q&A nobody's asking you a question, you can say, you know, I think there's a shy gentleman in the room. Before the speech, so-and-so had asked me, what about this, this, and this, and you know what, I'd like to address that as well. And then you go into that. So in a way, you have actually answered your own planted question that wasn't asked, or in case you didn't want to plant a question, then you can just bring it up and say, you know what, before my talk, I was talking to a bunch of people and somebody had this question. Let me bring it up for the general audience, because I had asked a gentleman that, you know what, I'm going to hold off on this till the end of the speech. So that's a really nice way to put it. Here's a little bit of bonus for you guys. Now, I'm going to teach you the most charismatic way on how to deal with a question when somebody asks it. First things first, what you have to do is you have to actually run over to the person who's asking the question and you say, oh, what's your name? Because you know what happens? Oftentimes, when speakers don't do this, they're waiting for somebody else to take a mic. Now, maybe the mic won't reach them in time and they'll start asking a question. And when that happens, you're still understanding what they're asking, but nobody else is. And you'll get caught up in answering a question that nobody really heard. And now everybody's just tuned out and they're just waiting for this to be over, because nobody really knows what's going on, because the person is facing you and you're facing them. Now, when the mic gets to them and you're the one who takes the mic to them, this is the best thing you should do, is you should say, oh, well, what's your name first? And when they first say their name, you introduce them to the whole audience and you say, this is so-and-so here, and they're asking a question. Now, what's your question? And when they ask the question, do repeat that as well, because sometimes they might not have spoken very clearly, or sometimes they might have spoken but nobody really heard them because they were not talking very loudly. So it's charismatic of you to rephrase that question. Gives you a couple of seconds to actually think of the answer in case you don't have the answer. And now I'm going to teach you a little bit of a sneaky trick. Do this if you need to. I do this often because sometimes I get caught up just with one person who asks me a second and a third question. So what I do is, while answering the question, I'll start walking backwards, like, doing a moonwalk backwards and answering their question, because if I get stuck over there, then they might want to take the mic from me. So for more on this, guys, you can go deeper in this by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and especially on LinkedIn. And if you put up a question, we're sure to get back to you on this one, because you know what? These things are important for me.